It's January 31st. Welcome to yes2hellwith.com. The SOU for You package, as well as the Liberty Dialogue series by itself for international purchasers, and the two reports will be available on yes2hellwith.com in addition to jamesbowersjohnson.com. This should clear up any confusion about the access to these documents and books. Now, this past week we examined definitions for person, United States person, and individual. We also examined real excise taxes, for example, the airline travel excise and the firearms occupational excise. And we saw what lawful federal taxation actually looks like when Congress does its job and does it clearly. Now let's put 26 USC Section 1 next to those statutes and look at the truth. Section 1 begins with familiar language. There is hereby imposed on the taxable income of every individual. At first glance, that looks like a legitimate levy, but structurally, it is nothing like the airlines excise or the firearms excise. And that difference matters. Real excises start with jurisdiction. Look at the airline excise under 26 USC 4261. Congress defines the taxable activity, air transportation, and defines jurisdictional domain, federally regulated air commerce. It identifies the liable party, the person making the payment, and ties obligation to a voluntary act. No ticket, no jurisdiction, no tax. That is a lawful structure. Now look at the firearms occupational tax under 26 USC 5801. Congress defines a regulated federal activity, limits the tax to importers, manufacturers, and dealers, ties jurisdiction to voluntary entry into a federally regulated occupation, and imposes a status-based excise only after the status exists. No occupation, no status, no tax. Again, this is a lawful structure. 26 USC Section 1 does none of this. Section 1 does not define what makes an individual taxable, where federal jurisdiction attaches, what conduct triggers liability, or how a living man or woman enters the taxable class. Instead, Section 1 assumes all of that work has already been done. It taxes taxable income of every individual without establishing jurisdiction, status, or a voluntary federal nexus. That is not how excises work. That is not how lawful taxation works. That is presumption, raw presumption, and I might add, fraudulent presumption. And that does the work that Congress failed to do explicitly. Section 1 is a rate schedule, not a complete tax. Structurally, Section 1 is incomplete. It provides rates, brackets, calculations. What it does not provide is the jurisdictional hook. Unlike the airlines excise, Section 1 does not say, upon the act of earning income within federal jurisdiction, and unlike the firearms excise, it does not say, on persons engaged in a federally regulated occupation. It simply assumes the subject is already inside the system. That assumption is fatal under the Liberty Dialogue's analysis. That is why enforcement runs backwards. Because Section 1 lacks clear jurisdictional structure, enforcement proceeds by presuming individual equals a taxable person. Presuming income equals taxable income. Presuming federal jurisdiction by silence. And forcing the burden onto the accused to disprove status. That inversion does not happen with real excises. No one buying an airline ticket has to argue jurisdiction. No firearms dealer has to guess whether they are regulated. Jurisdiction is created first, not later. Now here's the Liberty Dialogue's conclusion. 26 USC Section 1 is inferior because it does not define the taxable class. It does not establish jurisdiction. It does not tie obligation to a voluntary federal activity and relies on presumption instead of structure. By contrast, the airline and firearms excises identify authority, establish jurisdiction, define status or conduct, and let obligation arise last. That is the difference between lawful taxation and administrative coercion, and I'll say it again, fraudulent presumption. The Liberty Dialogues does not deny Congress's power to tax. It exposes where Congress failed to do lawfully. A real excise does not need silence to operate. A real excise does not need fear by definition. A real excise does not require presumption. Section 1 does. And that tells us everything. And as always, may truth reign supreme.